I'd like to explain to you how your quilting machine actually makes a good stitch. Once you understand that, you'll know how to use the proper needle size, as well as to make a good thread choice, and even decide on the quilting direction to give you the best stitch possible. Most quilting machines still operate on a rotary hook basis, similar to many domestic sewing machines. The great thing is that you can move that sewing head 360 degrees on your quilt. That doesn't change the fact that the needle and the hook assembly meet at the same place no matter which direction you happen to be moving. At least that's the goal. Let's take a look at how the needle comes down into the bobbin area. Your needle goes into the bobbin area, a hook comes around behind the needle, catches your thread, joins up with the bobbin thread, basically completing your stitch. The top thread has to pass completely around the bobbin area before it makes a stitch. It has a long way to go. The bobbin thread, however, has basically very little distance to travel. That's why quite often you'll find that your top tension needs to be tightened up as the bobbin tension pulls a little harder. It doesn't have quite so far to go, and the top thread has to make a bigger journey all the way around the hook. One other factor that can make a difference in the quality of your stitch is something called needle flex. Because your quilting machine will move 360 degrees all over your fabric, unfortunately it doesn't mean that you're going to use feed dogs to move nice and smooth all across that quilt surface. Your needle is going to flex or bend depending on the direction that you happen to be quilting. When you quilt to your right, when you're standing on the freehand side of the machine, if I'm standing on the freehand side looking at this needle now, if I move my quilting machine to the right, my needle will actually flex to the left. The needle will always flex in the opposite direction you happen to be moving. That's because the fabric puts drag on it, and once that drag is there, it bends the needle ever so slightly. Well, you know now, if that needle happens to be bending a little in one direction or another, and the hook assembly is coming around, expecting to meet it at the right time, if it's not there, your stitch quality is going to be compromised. So, the best quality stitch is going to be moving left to right, where the needle deflection is slight, and it's slight to the left. It's also going to be best when you pull that quilting machine towards you. We're now thinking in 3 dimensions, but if the hook assembly is behind the needle, and you pull the machine towards you, you actually close the gap between the needle and the hook, making it tighter. Those two actually kiss. If you move the opposite direction, push the quilting machine away from you, the needle actually drags toward you. When that happens, it opens up a little airspace between the needle and the hook assembly, and that can create a change in your tension. And lastly, moving in the opposite direction, if you move to your left, the needle drags to the right. And if it drags to the right, you can see that it's actually not going to get to the meeting place for the hook at the appropriate time to make a great stitch. So keep that in mind as you're choosing the direction that you quilt. In general, move from your freehand side of your quilting machine from left to right. On the pantograph side, that's right to left. That's going to make sure your needle deflection is minimal or hits the hook assembly at the proper direction. The needle size makes a big difference as well. If you know now that that needle is moving around as you quilt, it's common sense to think that the thicker the thread, the thicker the needle needs to be. As that needle stability increases, it'll have less flexibility. It means that your stitches are going to be a little bit nicer with thick thread in the bobbin or in the top. The last thing I want to mention to you is to realize that you actually can have great tension but be fooled by your eyes. Because you're moving a quilting machine very quickly across fabric, that needle has to be bigger than a domestic sewing machine needle so that that needle doesn't flex and break when it happens to hit the hook. You want it to be nice and stable to give you a great stitch. Because it's quite large, you'll often see a large hole left behind in your fabric because the needle shaft is large. Well, if your thread happens to be very fine or thin, it doesn't fill up that hole very much. You might take a look on the underside of your quilt and actually see the top thread inside the hole. Well, technically, your thread tension is only incorrect if the top thread is pulled completely to the back of the quilt. If you happen to see the color inside the hole, like this, you know that your tension is fine. It's only when that thread gets pulled clear to the back side of the machine, or excuse me, the quilt rather, that your tension is off. One great way to judge that, rather than to trust your eyes, is to use your fingernail. If you run your fingernail along the line of stitching, these are my stitch lines here, and I have a little loop of thread, my fingernail will catch on each one of those little loops of top thread. But if the thread is actually locked in the layers of the quilt, I won't feel that, but my eyes might actually see that thread inside the hole. So the next time you're using two different colors of thread, for example, and you're thinking that your tension is imbalanced, remember, you still might be seeing the thread inside the hole. And if you take the quilt off of your frame, give it a chance to relax, and even after you've bound it, toss it in the dryer on air fluff for a moment or two, most of those holes are going to close up. You can even coax those by rubbing your fingernail across them. Always choose a brand new sharp needle when you're starting a new project, and that will also help to make sure that your stitch quality is good.